You are listening to Proof Text, a Glossa House podcast exploring Scripture with Dr. T. Michael W. Halcomb and Dr. Frederick J. Long. Welcome and enjoy.
Hello and welcome to Proof Text. I'm Michael Halcomb, and today I'm here with a new friend. His name is Dr. Matthew Tanner, and I got his book right here. It's called The Wounded Pastor. And this is what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about some of our own stories as well, I'm sure. But I would commend this book to you, and hopefully after you listen to the podcast, you'll be way more interested. So, Matthew, it's nice to meet you. Thanks for coming on to Proof Text. And we were talking a little bit before the show. I was mentioning that one of my sort of annual things that I try to do is read Henry Nouwen's book called The Wounded Healer. And so your title, The Wounded Pastor, really grabbed me when I saw it. And of course, I'm a pastor and I've been very wounded at times. And so I thought, boy, this will be a fascinating read. But before we jump into the book, just tell our listeners a little bit about yourself in case they may be unfamiliar with who you are. So who are you? Where have you studied? What are you doing these days? And that sort of thing.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, the short answer to that is I tell people I was born in Illinois, educated in Arkansas, raised in Arkansas, educated in Missouri. Went to college at, College Ozarks. Thought I was going to go totally different direction, but you know how God has a way of reining us in to his sovereign will, and found myself fulfilling my call to ministry. 2 Timothy 2:15 was study to show yourself approved, and found myself at seminary. Got a master's of divinity in Midwestern Seminary in Kansas City. Went and pastored for a while. I've been a pastor. I've been a director of missions. I've done interim work, intentional interim work in Missouri and South Dakota, and then went back, and God led me to go back into my doctoral journey. Went to the doctorate with a completely different plan of what project I wanted to do, and the director of the doctoral program said, "You can't do that one." And so, but at the same time I was going through that, I found myself unjustifiably forced out of a church, and I began to look for a strategy. I began to look for help, and I didn't find anything. And so God said, "Go out and write it." So that's
Wow.
quickly my education. Beyond that, I know we're going to dive into the Wounded Pastor, so I don't want to get in there yet. But
yeah,
I've been married for almost 21 years to my much better half. Her name's Heather. I've got 3 daughters, Sarah, Shelby, and Samantha. 17, 14, and 10.
Well, all right.
And living the dream there with my girls. They're amazing. I jokingly tell people I'm the lone dinghy in the estrogen ocean in my world. But it's when I'm not studying, not pastoring, not doing missions and ministry and that sort of thing. You'll find me out on my bike. I like to cycle, and so I'm especially this time of year, I'm getting out and putting some miles in. I'm a son of a pastor, so I always tell people to read.
You were going to say something else. Good.
No, I guess I should say that better. I'm a pastor's kid.
There you go.
So, let's go back and edit that one. It's like, that was close. So, as soon as I said it, I thought, that's not the right show. Anyway, my dad was a pastor, so, don't hold that against me. I'm an identical twin, so, my brother gets... People ask him, about the book, and he's like, "Yeah, it's not who you think it is." So, we have a lot of fun with that. But nice. In my ministry, like I said, I've been through this phenomenon myself now 3 times. And
wow.
I've even had people tell me, well, maybe you weren't called to ministry and all those different things that they try to help with. And some of them turn into Job's friends,
Yeah.
Wow. But it's more like an Isaiah, Jeremiah ministry where you go into church and you say, this is what God's will is. This is the vision, the direction. And they just, I know I'm mixing some biblical stories here, but they'd say, no, we'd rather go back to Egypt. And because of that, you get pushed out. So through all that, I began to look for a strategy to heal. I began to reach out to some entities to try to find healing, and there was nothing there. So this is a product of my own survival, really. What I found is there's a lot of us out there.
Yeah.
There's a lot of us guys that have been hurt by the church and hurt by the ministry, and the vast majority that go through this never go back into ministry. So, and it's just trying to find a strategy to survive and to heal, but become stronger leaders and stay in the game. So that's kind of my past and how the Wounded Pastor came about.
Thank you. Yeah, and also, I mean, you got to spend some time maintaining that great beard you got. So,
I get comments, man. People all the time are like, "Why would you grow a beard like that? Why won't you cut it?" All these different things. And some people like it's polar opposite. You either love it or hate it. And I tell people, I said, I've never had so many people that interested in my facial hair. But there are 4 people in my life that love it, and anytime I try to trim it, they revolt, and so that's why I keep it. So it's great when I'm cycling because it's doesn't.
Right. Well, I was just telling someone, I think yesterday or the day before, an aspiring pastor about the fact that if you were to look at all the people that I went to Bible college with who were ministry majors of some sort, and 20 years-ish later, check to see how many of them were in ministry, I think out of 40 or 50, it might be 2 or 3. The numbers, really low.
Seminary that 10 years out, 50% of you won't be in the ministry. Now, they never told us what to do with that.
Yeah,
or how to shore that up or keep it from happening. But I think, like you said, I think 50% is a conservative number. I think it's more than that, especially the longer we go. It's more than that.
Yeah. So lots of hurting people. So in my sermon this past Sunday, in fact, I started. And I guess maybe it was a subconscious thing, but I started by sharing some of my own ministry horror stories. That was how I opened my sermon. So let's just start there, and then we'll sort of segue into your book. For me, when I was in Bible college doing my undergraduate work, I took on a part-time youth and children's pastor position at a small rural church in Kentucky. And the senior pastor who had a role in helping hire me soon became a tyrant. And I became fearful of going into church on Wednesdays and on Sundays. I never knew what sort of horrible remarks he was going to make to me or what kind of bullying was going to happen. And it just became a nightmare. And at the end of that, I found myself stepping out of the position and sitting in one of my professor's offices just bawling my eyes out.
Absolutely.
And then you fast forward a few years from that to my first full-time pastorate, and I was hired as the associate with the intent that in 2 years I would take on the senior role position. The guy I was under was super old school, in his 70s at the time, and that quickly became nightmare number 2. It was like anything I said, anything I did, this guy was taking notes, and I quickly learned that he'd bring stuff into a board meeting and just put me on blast in front of the elders and the deacons. You did this wrong. You said this wrong. You did this, laundry list every time. And so I learned quickly to watch my every move around him. And every Sunday morning, my stomach was in knots. I spent so much time in the restroom before going over to church on Sunday mornings. I didn't want to be there. I worked at a church camp where I worked under tyrants, and I've worked at a Christian school, same thing, and a Christian university, same thing. And so I'm wondering, why is it like this? I mean, so you in this book, Wounded Pastor, I think you interviewed 30 or 40 people, pastors, and you found that these folks, a lot of folks have been dealing with the same thing. And in fact, tell us a little bit about your own story. I mean, you said you found yourself in this position sort of multiple times too. So share as much as you want or can. And
Right.
yeah,
Well, and I'm working on a project now, hopefully to just kind of quantify my telling the actual stories, because that's what a lot of the guys identify with. But it kind of the same vein, and I interviewed both pastors and associate pastors, and a lot of the things came down to misplaced leadership, usurped authority, toxic leadership. I go into all those things, but with my story, it seems like, we realize nobody's perfect.
yeah,
We all have flaws, but none of them should be fatal flaws. And you think you should be able to grow and exist and form leadership within a church. But what you find out is those that are in usurped authority or toxic leadership or something like that will use those things to mob you. It's called a mobbing effect.
yeah,
They continue to put pressure and pressure. They won't outright fire you because they don't have an ethical or moral thing to stand on, but they will sure make life difficult until you get to the point you say, I'm out. I would rather go do anything else than to keep going into this on a day in, day out basis. And that's what I found in my ministry is individuals within the church, whether it be a Jezebel in the church, or a lot of times, unfortunately, it was a deacon who, especially, in certain churches, they've been there and they've seen pastors come and go. And so
right,
they are the real controller. They're the real leadership.
right,
I've had pastors say we can just get a new pastor. If we don't like what you're doing, we'll just go get another one.
yeah,
So I had a pastor one time not a pastor, sorry, a deacon get like nose to nose with me in a deacon's meeting and tell me, you need to figure out how we do things around here, boy. So, and this is in my office in the church.
yeah.
I
remember standing. So I preached this sermon one Sunday morning, and I remember standing in the foyer out, by the door as everybody was leaving, and shaking hands as everybody's leaving. This is in Kentucky, and a boy in college comes up to me and he grabs my hand and squeezes it really hard, gets in my face, and he says, "You ever say something to my little sister again, you're gonna regret it." And so evidently he was like talking about our youth lesson on Sunday morning,
right.
And evidently I said something his sister didn't like, and she went and told Big Brother, and here I am, the pastor, and I got a college guy in my face threatening me on the way out on Sunday morning.
And it leaves you surprised, like, why is this even in church?
Right. Right.
One of the most extreme examples that happened to me in one church that'll remain nameless, it was, I had fought against the established true leadership since I had been there. Typical, they say all the right things during the search process.
Right.
And when you get there, you find out what the real culture is like.
Right.
So the battle had been going on at this point for probably a year, this constant wearing down. But I guess I was too stubborn. I wasn't getting the message. So a deacon in the church took it upon himself to start a rumor in town that I had been unfaithful to my wife. And
oh my gosh.
And that was at the point where I sat down at my desk and I said, God, what am I going to do? And I went to, the Lord led me to Acts, and I just systematically read through Acts. And I said, Lord, I'm not stopping reading until you tell me what to do with this situation. And I got to the point where Paul says in Acts, when they began to revile and slander you, then shake off your cloak and go. And so that's when I was released from that ministry.
Wow.
And that's an extreme example. Some of the guys that I've interviewed through this have been taken through court battles, have been families attacked, wives attacked. I mean, they stop at nothing. And I've been asked the question, what exactly is being done? And that's a hard question to answer, because it's whatever they can think of. It's whatever they can attach to make you uncomfortable enough, to hurt just enough for you to say, I'm gonna bounce. I'm out of here. Y'all can have it. And then they get their control back. So that's usually what it is, and what I've learned. It runs the gamut of what they can do to try to just make life miserable.
So the candidates, or the people you interviewed throughout here, I noticed were mainly all Baptist in origin. Was that strictly because that's like mainly your network, or you just were looking at the Baptist denominations? I see Southern Baptist the majority, American Baptist, and then General Baptist. Like, I know you had reached out. I remember reading at one point you had reached out to like a Nazarene leader. I'm a Nazarene pastor. And then you had reached out to some other people for some statistics. But so what is the reason for the emphasis on Baptist church? Is that mainly because in your own circles, or?
Yeah, that was just because that was network driven.
Gotcha,
because I'd been in that network. I did the best I could in the time that I had. With the doctoral project, you kind of time constraint. I worked to try to reach out. The interviews were strictly or closer to my network. The research was a broad spectrum. So I appreciate you making that distinction. The reality is, those that I have talked to outside of just the Baptist network, the phenomenon is the same. It's really limited to evangelicalism, the congregational polity, things of that nature. There are some of those distinctives. There actually are some of the other evangelical denominations do a much better at counting than even the Southern Baptists do. Yeah. I can pick on Southern Baptists because I are one, but it's generally the numbers and the research are the same across all of the evangelical denominations. So, I appreciate that distinction. It was mainly because that was my network, and I had to get the interviews in a certain time frame, and those are the ones that identified more quickly. My hopes then, as this grows and goes on, I really want to do more research and eventually put out some updated versions. I know I'm already thinking that far ahead, and making sure my numbers are even more accurate, but reaching outside. And that's why I appreciate this so much, because it's reaching outside of the network I grew up in, because I know this is happening not just in the Baptist world, it's throughout evangelicalism.
Yeah. Well, it'll be interesting to see a broader network and look at the different sort of polity and how that shapes how a congregation or a leadership or a mob can, can work. One of the things I loved about this, you use this term post-traumatic spiritual stress disorder. And I was talking to a military guy a few years ago, and I had gone to Ethiopia. We've adopted several times. And when I came back from my last time, I was dealing with some post-traumatic stress stuff. I had a gun put to my head, like some crazy stuff happened in Ethiopia. And this military guy was frustrated that I was even suggesting that I could possibly have, PTSD. But I think people outside the military, certainly, they don't have a corner on that. Sorry if you're military and that offends you, but not sorry, right? So post-traumatic spiritual stress disorder, I think this is a real thing. And I think you've touched the nerve of something really important here, the way that pastors are hurt and pastors are wounded. And say a little bit more about this post-traumatic spiritual stress disorder.
Yeah, I mean, this is the main problem, because you come out of this, and before the wounded pastor, I never saw a strategy that you could build on to heal. And so what happens is those that do go back into the ministry, they stay wounded. And I kind of put it this way: they learn survival techniques or protective techniques. They don't learn leadership lessons. And I began to realize that when I was going into, for example, deacons meetings or business meetings and stuff like that, I was having the textbook symptoms of PTSD. Yeah. And I even went to a counselor and I said, look, man, why is this happening to me? I'm reading it about here. And I kind of heard from some that, like, well, you can't be that because it's church. And I'm like, but it is. And I have a friend of mine who is a Marine, and he did a tour in Iraq and a tour in Afghanistan. So he did two tours. And I asked him that question. And it's interesting. You use that illustration of the military person, and I'm not talking down about anybody in the military.
Sure.
But I asked this buddy of mine who is a Marine, and I said, is it okay? I'm asking a Marine permission. Can we use this term? I don't want to offend you guys. And he wrote a letter about that. And he said, absolutely, pastors can identify with this post-traumatic stress. And that's why I add post-traumatic spiritual stress disorder, because it's in the realm of the church. And he said, here's the difference. He said, as a Marine, you're deployed, but generally you have a really good idea. The enemy looks like this. And then he said, but you go out on patrols and you're on high alert and you have that heightened emotion and everything. But then you can go to the rear base, and then you've got brothers in arms who are standing guard at the gate. And so you can let your guard down. You can rest a minute. He said, pastors don't have that. He said, pastors, the Bible just shows how ministry is a battle. It's going to be a battle. I mean, we've got that little section on the armor of God for a reason. But he said, many times in the church world, the enemy is either not easily identifiable or the enemy looks like the friend.
Huh.
And so, because it looks like somebody, and I've heard this many times, I've said it myself, wounded pastors are being hurt by people who should know better and who we expect better from because they claim to be believers and they're in the church. The other issue he brought up is that there is no rear base for pastors to go to, that somebody else is guarding the door, that we can let our guard down and we can rest from it.
Yeah.
And so he said, absolutely, pastors are in a battle. They're in the war. And it is absolutely okay for them to sit there and realize, I have post-traumatic spiritual stress disorder. And when I began into my own life, began to use some of the therapy that is used for managing triggers, coping with trauma, stuff like that. And you see this in the emotional part of the strategy. I began to finally find some healing that I didn't previously have. So let's take it's kind of like everything else. Let's take the stigma off of it. Let's stop pretending that we are, untouchable bravado warriors that don't get hurt. And let's realize I have triggers. I have trauma that informs how I respond to situations, especially in ministry. And the counseling world, the medical world have some really good information on how to deal with PTSD. So let's start using that to help pastors heal.
Yeah, wow. That's great. I wonder, so I wonder if, I'm certain you're aware of what the Enneagram is, or these various types of personality tests. I think it'd be interesting to take one of those sort of matrices and do pastors with different personality types or personality tests tend to have more trouble in this area, or is that even across the board? Or are there certain personality types that are more resilient just by default? I don't know if you've thought in that direction at all, but that's something that I was thinking about as I was reading this. I'm an Enneagram 8. I don't like live and die by the Enneagram. Like some people say it's satanic. I don't go that far either. I think it's an interesting personality tool. Like I don't swear by it or anything like that. But so on an Enneagram 8, we're just kind of the people who we say it how it is. We like have a strong sense of right and wrong, a strong sense of justice and injustice. When we see injustice, we can't just let it go. We have to address it. And so, I've often wondered about the fact that, well, that's just how I am. And so that's caused problems for me in certain situations, vocationally, probably even in interviews where I've been too blunt or bold maybe to get the job, right? But yeah, so I wonder, have you thought any about how the personality types intersect with your research here?
That was one of the frustrations of an initial work like this, is there are so many different ways that I want to dive in even further. And one of the plans that I have is to take each level of the strategy, the economic, emotional, spiritual, and leadership, and expand them really into their own work. It's going to be a little bit smaller, maybe even workbook. And that's where I'll dive into more of the personality aspects. But I'll say this up front. I haven't dove into that other than just in my own mind and thinking, but it's a very poignant point that you make, that what I know at this point is that this is no respecter of a certain type of personality.
I see.
There are guys that are that type A. They're the more confrontational. I'm one of those that there's really no gray area with me. And it has gotten me into trouble in churches because I look at the Bible and it says this, and I look at the action and I'm like,
right.
Kind of the Bob Newhart counseling method. Stop it.
Right.
But there, I have interviewed some other pastors who are very much better in the shepherding category, more the introverted, more of the kind of partnering type personality, and they've all found themselves in this same category.
Well, all right.
So, initially, I don't know it's that there's a certain personality that kind of lends itself to this phenomenon. Yeah. However, I will say that your personality will inform the healing process.
Yeah.
On how you heal and how you deal with trauma. You developed, as I was talking with a buddy of mine who does Servants by Design. It's another tool for personality and stuff like that. And he talked about how you have this personality that you kind of develop as your upbringing, but then life, especially traumas and that sort of thing, develop phases of personality. And a lot of times those are protections.
Yeah. Right.
If you dive into trauma-based therapy and stuff like that, you begin to develop a personality that is protective, that manages triggers, or that just masks the personalities in the room. So you can, if I just become like you, then I won't get as hurt. You begin to do some of those things. So I think the personality is more formative after the phenomenon. But that's a great question. I would be interested to know if there are more or less in a certain personality, but it definitely informs how your healing will go.
What have you seen? I stepped into my current pastoral position 5 months before COVID. So I didn't get any of that honeymoon, none of that, right? I didn't even get like to sit down to meals with people. Like I was just 5 months in, and then boom, COVID for 2 years. Hawaii was one of the worst states to be in as far as COVID goes. Not to be incredibly political or anything, but we're certainly a democratic state. And from my perspective, I've only been here 6 years. It's almost like Hawaii is like the testing ground. We're the guinea pigs. They try stuff on out here in the island to see if it's going to work on the mainland. So we had mask mandates and other rules. They had stupid stuff like if I were to take my family to the beach, we all had to be 6 feet apart on the beach. Like, I mean, it's just crazy. But once we got in the water, we could be next to each other. Just like insane rules like that, right? Like, so the trauma coming out of COVID for pastors, I've seen it. I saw it all the way through. I'm wondering, like, has COVID exacerbated? This one wasn't just COVID, right? It was COVID and George Floyd and elections and Black Lives Matter and like tons of different things going on in the United States all at once. And pastors were in this position where anything they could say was potentially explosive, right? So if you're for a mask or you're not for a mask, or you're even in the middle telling people do what your conscience says, none of that was good enough for some people, right? And so we saw people leave our congregations, and I just wonder, what did you see, like, as far as post-traumatic spiritual stress disorder during and coming out of COVID?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that it made it worse. I think what it did is it exposed what's the best way to put it? Maybe a flaw in the system. It kind of brought to the forefront an attitude and an action that a lot of church members have based toward shepherding leadership that's really not anything new. For example, we jokingly say as pastors, if you've got let's say 50 people in your congregation, then you've got about 100 different job descriptions.
That's right. I mean? Yep.
So I don't think the things that we saw necessarily with the political stuff. I mean, let's face it, church members have been opinionated from the very beginning.
That's true. Yeah.
You read it in Scripture. Moses had to deal with the grumblings and the complaints and the questions of his leadership. So it's not a new phenomenon that all of a sudden has shown up here. But what I think, and it's timely, I think what has happened with some of these issues, it may have ramped up a little bit, but I think it's exposed an underlying phenomenal problem within the institution of the church, where these things are just happening. And one, I don't know about you, I wasn't prepared to navigate a lot of these things. So you're just
totally
doing the best you can. The one thing I do think, especially COVID, some of these had, pastors sometimes are bad about being isolated anyway. And if I've heard once, I've heard 100 times, is if I talk to pastors about this, one of the things that is so healing to them, even just by looking at this book, is they realize I'm not the only one that's gone through it.
Yeah, right.
This is a very isolating phenomenon.
Yeah.
It causes you to say, well, maybe I missed my calling, or maybe I am broken. And you feel like, you feel embarrassed to say, hey, I was forced to resign.
Yeah.
I was mobbed out of a church because, you're going to have some well-meaning people go, well, if you'd have just been a stronger pastor or a stronger believer, if you'd have just trusted God, and all of these are well-meaning things.
Right.
We're denying what's going on. We've got all these symptoms and we're denying the disease. So I think we've realized that, and I think what some of these things have made worse is caused pastors to be even more isolationists.
Yep.
But we've got to come together and realize, hey, it's okay to hurt.
So the whole like thrust of the book, The Wounded Pastor, is about this phenomenon of forced resignation and terminations. And you talk about some other types of resignation and terminations as well. But then, as you had mentioned a few moments ago, you're attempting to offer a strategy for, as you say, fallen and injured pastors and leaders that they can turn to for guidance and healing. And so let's talk a little bit about some of the leading reasons why pastors have to endure these forced resignations, and then two, let's talk about the strategy for the wounded pastor or leader coming out of that. So, what are some of the top reasons that you found for why pastors and leaders have to often endure these forced resignations?
Yeah, kind of really what I talked about earlier. It's hard to generalize because the reality is let me say it this way, it wraps around a lot of times misplaced leadership, usurped authority, things like that. But as far as the reasons that the churches use to force their pastors out, it's as broad as anything they can come up with.
Right.
You're reaching the wrong people. You're not visiting enough. You're not doing this enough. I had a church member tell me one time on a Sunday morning, you preach too much about sin. You should save that till Sunday nights. Of course, here's my bluntness came out, and I said, well, funny, I don't think you come on Sunday nights. That did not go over well. But anyway, so that's a hard question to answer because, and I do put some research in there about the top 10 reasons that are listed for resignations or terminations. In as far as frequency, number 9 and 10 are moral and ethical failure. And I've seen, at least in my research, that when there's a moral or ethical failure, the churches do a better job at the exit strategy and taking care of that particular pastor who was forced out for moral or ethical reasons. And what I mean by that is there was a biblical mandate, morally or ethically, that was defied. The determination was justified.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
But
that's an irony that I found in the book. Like that was really surprising for me to read, that when a pastor is forced to resign over some moral or ethical issue, the churches end up taking better care of them on the way out.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
It's kind of wild. I mean, some of the other things you say about, like the personal attacks in a church, like conflict over changes proposed. Well, we all know the stories about, the color of the carpet and the color of the paint, and those are legit things. I've experienced those. Conflict with lay leaders. Conflict, this is a huge one, with a patriarch or matriarch. Especially in these rural congregations that are small, that I don't think can be understated. That is a conflict over leadership style, expectations about the pastor's role. As you said, there's many job descriptions, or way more. If there's 50, there's 100 job descriptions.
Absolutely.
Conflict over doctrinal differences. Yeah,
and that's what I mean. The point comes down to there's a phenomenon of failure to follow the pastoral leadership that God has placed there. And they use the language during the search process of, we're asking God to send his man to our congregation. Yeah. And when he gets there, they don't trust God with it. And for all of those reasons, but really there's that phenomenon, that foundational principle of they just don't want to follow God's word. They don't want to go to the proverbial promised land or reach the vision that God's given for the church. We want to stay in Egypt, or we want to go back to Egypt. So we're going to sacrifice the shepherd, not equating pastors
right.
Christ by that. When I say sacrifice the shepherd, that's a lowercase s. The under shepherd God has put there It's a failure to understand the biblical mandates on elders and pastors and things like that. But as far as the reasons of why this happens, there's some foundational things that begin to rise up in the book, but it's really anything that they can come up with that they can use as leverage, they can use as an attack to just get this guy out of here so we can go get somebody else, or so we don't have to follow him.
Yeah, I wonder too. So I'm a Nazarene, and I know theologically we have some distinctives here, but also I wonder if there would be any differences between, because we have women pastors in our denomination, if the findings would yield any differences with female pastors. I assume there would be at least one or two, and the one that immediately comes to mind is just the sex of the pastor, right? Someone not being comfortable with or in favor of a female pastor, maybe not even for a scriptural reason or a theological reason, but just straight up, I don't want a woman to be a pastor, that kind of thing. So that's another thing that's curious to me, and I think would be super interesting to potentially look into down the road if more is built on this.
Yeah, absolutely, and I hope more is built on it, and that's the beauty of these conversations, and the beauty of, or the reality, I guess, is a better word, of this phenomenon. Is it really is affecting. It's a little bit simplistic, but it's affecting congregations with that congregational polity.
Yeah.
And really, that's largely most of evangelical world. And, I believe I can say this. I think you and I maybe doctrinally would disagree, but have a great debate, a great conversation over coffee over that issue of women pastors. And this is not the format to do that. And maybe one day, just fly me out to Hawaii and we'll have coffee and we'll talk about it. Right? But the reality is that it's a broader issue in evangelicalism, and we can debate. Again, this is not the time to debate those theological distinctives. We can still be friends, even though we disagree, that sort of thing. But what it is, it's that silent killer in evangelicalism that is destroying churches and getting pastors out of the game completely. Like I said, the greater majority, I think in my research, 60 to 70% of wounded pastors don't go back into the ministry.
Yeah.
So we're losing a big group every year, and this happens every year. So losing a massive group of leaders in the church that are just out of the game because they'd rather do anything else. And it's a sad day when you have people who are genuinely called to the ministry that are willing to do anything else but step into a church. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it takes a toll on the pastor and the pastor's family, right?
Oh, absolutely.
I can't imagine the story you were going through earlier, how that must have affected your marriage, at least for a season, of the person making up that rumor. That's some serious stuff, and the humiliation and the shame and the embarrassment and all the dynamics that go along with that. So pastors know this, and my wife knows this, right? That I don't tell my wife stuff about people in the church. Like, I don't want it to cloud her view of the church or of people. So when somebody hurts me or badmouths me, it's going to be very rare that my wife will know about that or hear about that. And so, as you're saying, pastors bottle this up. For me, one thing I've found, weekly therapy, regardless of whether I'm in a good season or a tough season, I still see my therapist every week.
Absolutely.
And I've tried to convey in my messages, my sermons, to just the congregants, like, this is a healthy practice. There's no shame in this. There's no embarrassment. Like, even if things are going well, find that therapist to talk to on a regular basis.
Yeah, I can remember my counseling professor in seminary said every pastor needs a good therapist, and we
Yeah.
kind of laughed it off a little bit. But I'm not ashamed to say I've been in therapy for the last year.
Yep.
You know, well, a type of but intensive therapy
Yeah.
for the last several months at least, and we realized, you can't get healed unless you admit that you're broken.
Yeah. Right.
And sometimes, you've heard the saying that doctors make the worst patients.
Mm.
I think pastors sometimes make the worst patients when it
Yeah.
comes to getting them, because we're supposed to be the strong one. We're supposed to
Right.
be. We're leading the flock, man. We're teaching. We're the ones. I mean, people come to us for help, but we realize again this is a very isolating phenomenon, in that you can't do this by yourself. And that's one of my prayers and my goals, hopefully with the Wounded Pastor, is at least to create a network where wounded pastors can find each other. Because, I mean, you look in Scripture, anytime God sent out people, it was always in pairs. Jesus, when he sent out the disciples, go 2 at a time. If you look in Scripture and you look at those that went out by themselves, isolated, they were usually chewed up and spit out pretty quick. So, but we think we're stronger than that. So realizing we've got to have that community, we've got to have that therapy. Stop ignoring the symptoms. It's okay to wear that moniker of, hey, I've got PTSD and I have to live my life differently. I've got to learn some things. That's okay. Yeah. It's okay to call yourself a wounded pastor. Let's start healing, because what I've found is I've walked myself through this, and I've talked to some other guys that have put some of these things into practice. And I don't say this just because it's my book, but it's like, guys, this works. There's some preventative stuff in there, but the strategy will work, and you can, shed some of the pain and some of the suffering and some of the wounded, and heal some of those wounds. Man, life is sweet.
So, in just like, I don't know, a minute or so, sum up the strategy. I don't want to give like all the spoiler away.
Right.
I want people to read your book and get your book. But so what you do is you develop a strategy for wounded pastors. We're talking about these horror stories, these ministry horror stories and war stories. But you begin to develop a strategy, and it's in its nascent stages. I think you'll, as you keep researching and thinking and interviewing, I think you'll add on to this.
Absolutely.
But, so what are you use this analogy of a house.
Yeah.
And tell us a little bit about your strategy as you're getting it off the grounds here.
Absolutely. Well, and I just say a couple of things about each level, because I do want to tell people, go get the book and read it. But it starts in the basement level, the darkest level, and that's the economic level. Because what has happened, if I'll just say it simply, if you're not paying the bills, you're not thinking about anything else.
Yeah.
You're just trying to think, how can I take care of my family? You're going and working construction. You're working whatever you can find, and that's where I put a lot of preventative stuff. Because of the situation we live in, we as pastors must start realizing we are in a high-risk profession. What I mean by is that it's a high risk of that turnover, a high risk of losing a position. So prepare for it. So I start on that first level of economic, and some things that you can do, because what I found in my research is that severances cannot be relied on. Rarely do you get enough to make it very long. So as long as you're doing the economic level, or you're stuck there, it's at that point when it happens, that's the darkest level, because that's all you can concentrate on. Once you begin to alleviate some of those things, the body of Christ begins to help, and you begin to find some footing, then you can go up to the next level. And I get this question a lot of, why did I go to emotional first and then spiritual? Because the reality is, when you're dealing with the triggers of PTSD, post-traumatic spiritual stress disorder, when you're dealing with the wounds and the hurts, I describe it this way. If you look at the Psalms, a lot of David's Psalms, especially when he was going through his difficult moments, The first half of the psalm is the emotional part of the strategy. The second half of the psalm is the spiritual strategy. Because the first thing David does is like, how long, O Lord, am I going to suffer like this?
Mm.
How long are my friends, are my enemies going to attack me? And it's dealing with those wounds and just trying to find some emotional stability. And while you don't have emotional stability, you're not thinking about your relationship with the Lord. And I know that's kind of crazy to say as a pastor, but you're dealing with the post-traumatic stress disorder triggers. You're just trying to emotionally survive. So I put in the book some ways to heal from that, how to learn your triggers, how to use PTSD type therapies to get better. But then the next level, that's when you really began to deepen your relationship with the Lord in the spiritual strategy. You began to, where David moves into, it's like when he moves into, but you, Lord, you're still God. You're still on the throne. I'm no longer mad at you, God, for your people hurting me and all of these things. You began to just really heal in your relationship with the Lord. And so once you find economic stability, then you began to deal with your emotional wounds, and then you began to repair that relationship your relationship with the Lord, because the hurt comes from quote unquote God's people and the church. Once you're able to do all those, then you can step out on the balcony and you can actually enjoy the view again. And what I mean by that is you can take an honest assessment as who you are as a person. You're no longer angry at the church. You're no longer blaming. You're no longer waking up in the middle of the night, raging at the people that hurt you and all of those things. You're able to go, let me take a really in-depth look at myself. How can I grow? How can I be better? Not survival techniques, not how can I keep from being hurt, but how can I grow with the emotional stability, with the spiritual growth? What are some things that the Lord can teach me to where I can be a better leader? To give a big biblical example of that, that's when Jethro sits down with Moses and says, hey, you need to get some governors. You're trying to do too much. It's getting past those things, getting past the people grumbling and realizing here's some things that I can learn and put into place to become a better leader. So that's kind of in a nutshell. That's why I developed strategy the way I did, and why it leads up to that, enjoying the view. And that's when you get up on the balcony, then you begin to see clearly, experience that fresh air, and go, yeah, I can go back into ministry and I can serve God's people again.
Excellent. Well, man, there's a lot more I could talk about in the book. I want people to pick it up, and they can get this at the publisher's website. I'm assuming they can get it at Amazon.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, it's on Amazon.com. It's on BarnesandNoble.com. They can go to Acclaimed Press website and look at the author's page, or just search there, The Wounded Pastor. I'm launching a website here soon called woundedleadership.com, and they'll be able to get it on that. So there's plenty of different ways to find it.
And can people connect with you on social media platforms? How would they maybe do that?
Yeah, the easiest way to do that is right now, eventually it will be woundedleadership.com. I'm in the middle of transitioning all that, but they can go to the woundedpastor.wordpress.com, and all of my social media links are on that. Okay. My social media links will be on the website. You can also email me if you want, if you want to talk about this, invite me to speak, things like that. Email thewoundedpastor@gmail.com. And those links right now, my Facebook is just Matthew Tanner on Facebook. You'll see all the stuff about the Wounded Pastor, because there's Matthew Tanner, surprisingly, is a more common name that I expect.
All right.
But I'm on LinkedIn, Instagram. On Instagram is the Wounded Pastor. So search me out, get on the blog, and then later the website, and you'll be able to hook up with me.
Excellent. Well, one of the things that I didn't tell you, I don't know if I told you this, but one of the things we do on the podcast, we end our episodes, the interview ones, with a quote we call it a parting shot. And I didn't invite you to do that today, like I do everyone else, because I was
Right.
going to let one of your interviewees be our parting shots.
Please do. Please do.
And so we don't have to discuss. We just got to let this hang.
Yes.
And so one of the wounded pastors, this is a quote from them. We kind of touched on this, but they say, as a pastor, it's so difficult to share your burdens with church members for fear that the information shared can be used later against you. Church members have no idea what pastors have to deal with. I had nowhere to turn for emotional support. Yeah. Well, Matthew, thank you, man, for meeting, and thanks for writing the book, and thanks for sharing this with us, and we look forward to see what lies ahead in the future. And thanks for coming on the podcast.
Absolutely, man. Thank you for having me. Thank you to Proof Text and for seeing the need, believing in this, and helping me get the word out. My dream of this is to get more of us wounded pastors to stay in the field, stay in the game, but to be complete and be whole again. So
Yeah.
For all the wounded pastors that are listening to this, I pray for you guys daily, even if I don't know you by name. Get the book. I know it'll help you, and I can't thank you enough for bringing me on today. Thank you.
Yeah, I would say too, even if you know a minister in your life, children's minister, youth minister, senior minister, anyone in ministry, just get them this book, because it can be preemptive too.
Absolutely.
So even if you and likely if you know a minister and it doesn't seem like they're struggling in some regard or wounded in some regard, you probably just don't know.
You'd be surprised.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So this may be a great gift to some folks. So yeah, thanks to everybody who continues to support Proof Text. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. We hope that this episode has been a blessing and it's been helpful. Until next time, aloha.
Interested in growing your ancient language skills but not sure where to start? Glossa House can help. From illustrated readers and short stories to lexicons and grammars, Glossa House offers a variety of resources for beginning, intermediate, and experienced ancient language learners. Head to glossahouse.com today. Glossa House, language resources for the global community.